The monitors had flatlined. The doctors stepped back. In the most expensive private room in St. Matthew's Hospital, Victoria Sterling, one of the most powerful women in the country, was on her knees beside her 8-year-old son's bed, clutching his small, motionless hand, while a team of the nation's top specialists quietly confirmed there was nothing more they could do. The room smelled of antiseptic and defeat. And then, from the corner of the waiting area just beyond the glass, a black man in his early 40s wearing a worn jacket and work boots stood up and walked toward the door. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a specialist. He was just a single dad. But in the next few minutes, he would do what no one in that hospital could. If stories like this are the kind that stay with you, hit subscribe and follow along. There's more where this came from. The charity gala at St. Matthew's Hospital had been running smoothly for most of the evening. The ballroom on the ground floor had been converted into something resembling elegance, white tablecloths, soft lighting, a string quartet playing near the entrance. Donors in tailored suits and designer dresses moved between tables, exchanging pleasantries over glasses of wine, writing checks with the quiet satisfaction of people who believed money could fix most things. Marcus Johnson had been there since 4 in the afternoon, crouched behind a speaker column near the back wall, rerouting an audio cable that the venue's regular technician had installed incorrectly. He wasn't a guest. He was the man nobody looked at twice. Marcus was 42 years old, broad-shouldered but not imposing, with the kind of face that had learned to stay neutral in rooms where he didn't belong. He worked for a small electrical contracting company in the city, the sort of job that paid steadily enough to keep the lights on and his daughter fed. His 7-year-old Lily had come with him that evening because the after-school program had closed early, and he hadn't been able to reach the neighbor who sometimes watched her. She sat in a folding chair near the service entrance, shoes dangling above the floor, working through a coloring book with the focused intensity only children can manage in noisy rooms. Nobody at that gala would have guessed that Marcus had once worked under conditions far more chaotic than a malfunctioning sound system. 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat paramedic had taught him to read situations quickly, to notice what didn't fit, to stay calm when everything around him was falling apart. He had returned home with a steady pair of hands and a mind that cataloged details automatically, even when he didn't want it to. He had tried, in the years since leaving the military, to let that part of himself go quiet. After his wife Dana died 3 years ago, it had become easier to simply stop engaging with medicine, with hospitals, with the version of himself that believed intervention was ever worth the cost. He hadn't been back inside a hospital since the day he signed Dana's death certificate. Victoria Sterling arrived at the gala the way she arrived everywhere, slightly late, instantly noticed. She was 45, with dark hair pulled back in a style that suggested control rather than vanity, and she wore a charcoal dress that was expensive without being showy. The founder of Sterling Capital, one of the most influential private investment firms on the East Coast, Victoria, had built her empire through a combination of genuine intelligence and an absolute refusal to be underestimated. She'd been the evening's headline donor, having pledged a significant sum toward the hospital's pediatric cardiac unit, an irony that would not become apparent until later. Beside her walked Ethan, her 8-year-old son, dressed in a small blazer he clearly found uncomfortable. He kept tugging at the collar as they crossed the room, and Victoria kept redirecting his hand away from it with the automatic patience of a mother who had fought this particular battle many times before. Ethan was the one constant in a life that had otherwise been rebuilt from scratch after her divorce 3 years ago. He was bright, curious, prone to asking questions at inconvenient moments, and he was in every way that mattered to Victoria the reason she got out of bed each morning. The evening proceeded without incident for nearly 2 hours. Marcus finished the cable work, tested the audio levels, and had settled into a chair near the service corridor to wait out the remainder of the event before packing up his equipment. Lily had fallen into a light, tilted sleep against his shoulder. The speeches began. Victoria was introduced to applause, said the right things in the right order, and returned to her table. Ethan, seated beside her, was growing restless in the way children do when they've exhausted their patience with adult events. He'd been fidgeting with a program booklet, folding and unfolding it, when a small commotion near the entrance drew the attention of several guests and caused a brief, gentle surge in the crowd, the kind that happens when a late arrival creates a bottleneck at the door. It was brief. No one fell. No one was knocked down. But in the movement, Ethan was jostled and caught a glancing impact against his chest from the elbow of a man stepping sideways to avoid the crowd. It wasn't hard. It wasn't the kind of thing that would make a parent look twice. Ethan winced, pressed his hand briefly to his sternum, and then looked up at his mother with the uncertain expression of a child deciding whether something is worth crying about. Victoria touched his shoulder and asked if he was okay. He said yes. She believed him. 4 minutes later, Ethan's face went pale. Not gradually, it was the kind of color change that happens all at once, like a light being adjusted. He blinked, slowly, reached for his mother's arm, and then his body simply gave out. The chair scraped backward as Victoria caught him. He was unconscious before he reached her lap. His lips faintly blew a shallow and irregular rhythm to his breathing that sent the nearest guests lurching backward. The room transformed in seconds. Someone called for a doctor. Several doctors were already moving. Within 3 minutes, a medical team from the hospital's upper floors had been paged and was converging on the ballroom. Within 6, Ethan was on a gurney being moved to the private care wing. The initial read was immediate and confident anaphylaxis. A severe allergic reaction possibly triggered by something he'd eaten at the event. The treatment protocol was well established, and the team moved through it with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times. Epinephrine airway management, IV fluids. Victoria was ushered into the corridor outside the room and told the team was handling it. Marcus had watched all of it from 30 feet away. He hadn't moved from his chair during the initial panic, partly because Lily had startled awake, and he needed a moment to settle her, and partly because the room was already full of people who knew what they were doing. He watched the gurney disappear through the corridor doors. He watched Victoria follow. He sat with Lily until she drifted back to sleep, and then he stayed in his chair because there was nowhere else to go, and the equipment still needed to be packed. The gala had effectively ended. Staff moved quietly around the room. The string quartet had stopped playing. An hour passed. Marcus had most of his equipment coiled and crated. Through the glass panel beside the corridor doors, he could see the edge of the private care wing, not the room itself, but enough of the hallway to catch movement, the occasional pass of a nurse, the steady orange indicator light above the door that signaled a room in active use. He wasn't watching deliberately. He just noticed things. He always had. It was when a second cart was wheeled in, this one carrying a crash unit, not a standard treatment trolley, that something shifted in his attention. He stood without fully deciding to. He moved toward the glass. Inside, through the narrow window, he could see the monitors above Ethan's bed. He could see the team working. He could see from the way they were positioned and the equipment they were using that they were still running the anaphylaxis protocol, escalating it, in fact. More epinephrine. More aggressive fluid management. Marcus looked at the boy's skin. No hives. No swelling around the face or throat. The lips were still faintly blue, but there was no visible edema, none of the external markers that almost always accompanied a true anaphylactic event in a child. He looked at the cardiac monitor. Even from his distance and angle, the waveform was visible enough for his eyes to find what trained eyes inside the room had not yet stopped to look for. The T-wave pattern was wrong. Not the wrong of a body in allergic shock. The wrong of a heart misfiring at the electrical level. He had seen that pattern before, not in a hospital. In a field kit on a dirt road outside Kandahar, bent over a 23-year-old soldier who'd taken a low-velocity impact to the chest during a vehicle incident and whose heart had decided at precisely the wrong moment in its electrical cycle that it was done. Commotio cordis. A disruption triggered not by force, but by timing a blunt impact landing in that narrow window of vulnerability between heartbeats. In a child with an undetected structural defect in the cardiac wall, the kind that caused no symptoms, until a specific trigger found it, the result could look exactly like this. The team inside was treating the wrong condition. Every dose of epinephrine they administered was stimulating a heart that didn't need stimulation. It needed to be slowed and stabilized, not pushed. Marcus stood at the glass for a long moment. His hands were still. His face was still. But something behind his eyes was moving fast, weighing, calculating, dragging up memories he had spent 3 years trying to bury. The last time he had been certain about something medical, he had said nothing. He had deferred to the doctors, told himself they knew more than he did, told himself it wasn't his place. He had signed the certificate 7 days later. Lily shifted in her chair behind him, small and asleep, her coloring book open across her knees. He looked back at her. He thought about what it would mean to walk through that door, the resistance he would face, the way he would look a man in work boots and a worn jacket telling a team of specialists they were killing the patient they were trying to save. He thought about how that story ended usually. He thought about Dana. Then he turned back to the glass, looked at the boy on the other side of it, and walked to the door. He pushed it open before he could talk himself out of it. The nearest nurse turned immediately. The lead physician, a silver-haired man in his late 50s named Dr. Richard Calloway, looked up from the bedside with the sharp, controlled expression of someone accustomed to being interrupted by the wrong people. Victoria, standing in the far corner of the room, straightened at the sight of him. Marcus said clearly and without preamble, "You're treating the wrong condition." The room did not respond the way rooms do in movies. No one stopped and listened. Dr. Calloway's expression moved from surprise to irritation in under a second, and a nurse was already moving toward the door to summon security. Victoria stepped forward, her voice carrying the precise, calibrated edge of a woman who had built a career on not being pushed around. "Who are you?" she asked. "How did you get in here?" Marcus didn't look at her. He looked at Dr. Calloway, because Calloway was the only person in this room whose next decision would matter. "I know how this looks," he said. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to look at his T-wave on that monitor and tell me what you see." Security arrived in the doorway behind him. Dr. Calloway raised one hand slightly, not to Marcus, but to the guard in the reflexive gesture of a man who needed 2 more seconds to think. He looked at the monitor. The waveform sat there quiet and damning, tracing the same aberrant pattern it had been tracing for the past hour, while everyone in the room had been watching everything else. Dr. Calloway looked at it for a long time. The guard stayed in the doorway. Nobody moved. The monitor beeped steadily in the silence, and Marcus stood very still in the middle of the room, out of place in every visible way, absolutely certain of the one thing he could not yet prove, and waited. Dr. Calloway looked at the monitor for 7 seconds. Marcus counted them. Then the physician turned back to the room with the expression of a man who had just found something he didn't want to find. Not alarm exactly, but the careful stillness of someone recalibrating. "Hold the next dose," Calloway said to the nurse at the IV line. His voice was level, the kind of level that required effort. The nurse looked up startled because the next epinephrine push had already been drawn and the protocol called for it, but Calloway's hand came up again in that same slight authoritative gesture, and she set the syringe down. Victoria moved forward from the corner of the room. "What's happening? Why did you stop?" Calloway didn't answer her immediately. He looked at Marcus instead, a long, assessing look, the kind that strips a person down to what they actually know versus what they merely believe. "You said the wrong condition," Calloway said. "What condition are you treating?" Marcus told him. He kept it short. The T-wave anomaly, the absence of hives or edema, the chest impact 40 minutes before Ethan collapsed the narrow electrical window that made commotio cordis possible, the likelihood of an underlying structural defect that had never announced itself until now. He used the language correctly because he had spent years earning the right to use it, even if nothing about him in that room suggested it. Calloway listened without interrupting, which was itself a form of answer. When Marcus finished, Calloway turned to the team and said, "I want an echo, now, and someone get cardiology on the phone." Victoria stepped directly into Calloway's path. She was not a woman who waited at the edges of conversations that concerned her son. "Someone needs to tell me who this man is and why he just changed my son's treatment plan." Calloway met her eyes steadily. "Miss Sterling, right now I need you to let us work." She didn't move immediately. She looked at Marcus, really looked at him, the worn jacket, the complete absence of any credential or affiliation that would explain his presence in this room, and something in her expression moved between fury and something harder to name. Then she stepped aside, not because she trusted what was happening, because the alternative was to keep fighting in a room where her son's heart was beating wrong. The echocardiogram technician arrived within 4 minutes. The cardiology fellow on call came through the door 90 seconds after that. Marcus stayed near the wall out of the way, watching the monitor with the focused quiet of a man who had learned that the most useful thing you could sometimes do was simply not leave. The security guard had retreated to the doorway but hadn't gone. Nobody had formally invited Marcus to stay, and nobody had made him go. The echo took 11 minutes. When the images resolved on the technician's screen, the cardiology fellow leaned in close, then straightened, then leaned in again. He pointed to something in the lower portion of the image, a structural irregularity along the atrioventricular wall, small, congenital, the kind of thing that produced no symptoms under ordinary conditions and would never have appeared on a routine pediatric checkup. Under ordinary conditions, Ethan could have lived another decade without knowing it was there. Under the specific conditions of that evening, a low-impact blow to the chest landing at precisely the wrong moment in his cardiac cycle, in a boy whose heart had a hidden architectural weakness, it had been enough. Calloway ordered the protocol shift. Beta blocker to stabilize the electrical activity, careful cardioversion to coax the rhythm back toward normal, the epinephrine abandoned entirely. The team moved with a different quality of efficiency, now not the confidence of people executing a familiar plan, but the focus of people who understood the stakes of getting this particular thing right. 8 minutes after the new protocol began, Ethan's heart rate began to even out. Not dramatically, not the sudden cinematic recovery of a body deciding to live. It was gradual number by number on the monitor, each increment small enough that you had to watch carefully to believe it was real. But it was real. The blue tinge at his lips faded by degrees. His oxygen saturation climbed back toward the range where it belonged. By the time the attending cardiologist arrived from the upper floors, the immediate crisis had been pulled back from its edge. Victoria stood against the far wall with her arms crossed over her chest and her eyes fixed on her son's face. She hadn't spoken in 20 minutes. When Ethan's hand moved a small, involuntary flexing of his fingers, the first voluntary motor activity since he'd lost consciousness, she pressed her knuckles briefly against her mouth and then put her hand back down. She did not look at Marcus. But in the new quiet of the room, with the monitors settling into something closer to normal, her eyes moved briefly in his direction before returning to her son. The investigation began before morning. By the time Ethan had been stabilized and moved to a monitored room in the cardiac care unit, someone on the hospital's administrative staff had already filed an internal incident report. A man without medical credentials had entered a patient's room during active treatment, made clinical recommendations, and those recommendations had altered the care protocol of a high-profile patient. The hospital's legal team was involved by midnight. By 6 in the morning, a local news van had parked outside the main entrance, its antenna raised. The story that reached the public first was the version that wrote itself most easily: uncredentialed man intervenes in billionaire's son's emergency treatment. The details underneath were more complicated, but complicated details don't travel as fast as clean narratives, and the clean narrative had Marcus as either a reckless interloper who got lucky or a fraud who had inserted himself into a vulnerable situation for reasons that hadn't yet been fully explained. Both versions circulated simultaneously before noon. Marcus found out from a neighbor who texted him a screenshot at 7:45 in the morning. He was sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, Lily eating cereal across from him, and he looked at the headline on his phone without any particular expression while Lily asked whether she needed her raincoat for school. He told her yes, probably the sky looked uncertain. He put his phone face down on the table and finished his coffee. The hospital's inquiry board contacted him that afternoon through a formally worded letter delivered to his employer's office requesting his presence at a review meeting within 48 hours. The letter was polite and contained no accusation, but the framework it outlined unauthorized access to patient care areas. Potential violation of medical practice statutes was not designed to make him feel welcome. His employer, a decent man named Gary, who ran the contracting company out of a converted garage in the warehouse district, called Marcus personally and told him the hospital had also been in touch with them. Gary's tone was careful, the tone of a man trying to figure out which side of a situation he was standing on. Inside the hospital, the dynamic had fractured along predictable lines. Two of the physicians who had been in the room during the original treatment, neither of whom had caught the T-wave anomaly themselves, had given statements to the inquiry board suggesting that Marcus's intervention had created confusion and unnecessary delay, and that the improvement in Ethan's condition was more attributable to the team's own adaptive response than to any outside input. Dr. Calloway had given a different statement, factual and unembellished, confirming exactly what had occurred and in what sequence. The discrepancy between the accounts was itself a kind of answer, but inquiry boards move slowly, and in the meantime, the public version of events was being shaped by people who hadn't been in the room. Victoria was being handled by her own team. Sterling Capital's communications director had drafted a statement within hours of the first news cycle, and the board of directors had been in contact by morning. The hospital where Ethan was now recovering was one of two medical institutions that Sterling Capital had funded significantly over the past 4 years. The implication, never stated directly, always clearly understood, was that the foundation's continued relationship with the hospital was not entirely separable from how publicly the institution chose to position itself on the question of Marcus Johnson. Victoria had not issued any statement. She had not left the hospital. She had spent the night in the chair beside Ethan's bed, and when her communications director came to her room at 9 in the morning with a tablet and a drafted paragraph, she had looked at it once and handed it back without comment. Ethan was awake by mid-morning, groggy and bewildered and asking for water. He didn't fully understand what had happened to him, and Victoria had kept the explanation simple. His heart had needed help. The doctors had helped it. He was going to be fine. He had accepted this with the practical trust of a child who believes the adults around him have things under control. He'd asked if he could have the television remote. She had given it to him, and then stepped into the hallway and stood there for a long time with her back against the wall, not crying, because Victoria Sterling had not cried in a professional context since she was 31 years old, and she was not going to start now. But her hands were shaking very slightly, and she noticed it and made them stop. She thought about the man in the worn jacket. She thought about the way he had spoken, not with the performing confidence of someone who wanted to be believed, but with the flat, load-bearing certainty of someone who didn't actually care whether he was believed, who was saying what he was saying because it was true, and because the alternative was silence, and he had apparently decided silence was no longer available to him. She didn't know what to do with that. She had spent her entire career learning to identify people who were telling her what she wanted to hear versus people who were telling her the truth, and she was very good at it, but this didn't fit either category cleanly. She had asked someone on the hospital staff quietly to pull whatever background they could on Marcus Johnson, not through official channels, just what was findable. By early afternoon, she had a summary on her phone: U.S. Army Combat Medical Specialist, 2 deployments honorably discharged. A period of employment with a civilian emergency response organization after his return. Then a gap, then the electrical contracting work. There was a flag in the record from 3 years ago, an internal review at a hospital connected to his wife's death. The details of the review were not available through informal channels, but the outcome was cleared of any wrongdoing, case closed. Victoria read the summary twice. She put her phone away. She went back into Ethan's room and sat down beside him and watched him watch television with the uncomplicated absorption of a boy who had no idea how close things had come, and she thought about the internal review and the gap in the record and the way Marcus had looked when he walked through that door, like a man who had made a decision that cost him something to make. She didn't know the full shape of what it cost. Not yet. At 11:47 that night, the monitors in Ethan's room triggered a cascade alert. His oxygen saturation dropped 14 points in under a minute. His heart rate spiked and then destabilized the rhythm, fracturing into the irregular, dangerous pattern that the team had worked through the previous evening. The attending nurse responded in under 30 seconds. The on-call cardiologist arrived 2 minutes later. The room filled again with the controlled urgency that Marcus had witnessed from outside the glass the night before. But this time, the situation was different. The structural defect that had been identified but not yet surgically addressed was no longer staying quiet. The blockage was progressing. The protocols the team had used to stabilize Ethan overnight were not holding, and the cardiologist on call was making emergency calls to the attending surgeon, running calculations, trying to determine whether Ethan could be stabilized enough to survive a procedure or whether the window for that decision was already beginning to close. Marcus was not in the hospital when the alert fired. He was in the parking garage, sitting in the driver's seat of his truck with the engine off. He had come back after dropping Lily at the neighbor's, not entirely sure why, telling himself he just needed to know the boy was stable before he could sleep. He had been sitting there for 40 minutes watching the entrance, not going in. His phone was in his jacket pocket. He hadn't turned it back on since the news cycle started. He didn't know, sitting in that dark garage, that somewhere above him, the 8-year-old boy whose heart he had already saved once was running out of time again. Marcus turned his phone on at 12 minutes past midnight. He didn't have a specific reason. He had been sitting in the parking garage for nearly 90 minutes by then, and something had shifted in the quality of the silence around him. Not a sound, not a signal, just the particular stillness that settles over a person when they've been avoiding a decision long enough that the decision starts to feel like it's already been made. The screen lit up with a backlog of notifications he didn't read. He opened his contacts, instead stared at nothing for a moment, then got out of the truck. The main entrance was still staffed at that hour. The night attendant recognized him not warmly, but with the careful neutrality of someone who had been briefed. Marcus told her he needed to speak with Dr. Calloway. She told him Dr. Calloway was not on overnight rotation. Marcus said he would wait. She picked up her phone. He sat down in one of the chairs near the entrance and put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor. 20 minutes later, a woman came through the interior doors at a pace that wasn't quite running. It was Victoria. She was still in the same clothes from that morning, her hair no longer pulled back, and the composure that had been so precisely maintained through the previous 24 hours had thinned to something raw and closer to the surface. She had been told by the front desk that Marcus Johnson was sitting in the lobby, and she had come down immediately because in that moment, with her son's monitors alarming upstairs and the surgical team trying to find a foothold, Marcus Johnson in the lobby was the most useful piece of information she had received all night. She saw him in the chair and came directly toward him. "He's crashing again," she said. The words came out flat, not because she was calm, but because she had gone past the register where panic is loud. "It's worse than last night. They can't stabilize him." Marcus stood. "What are they doing?" Victoria told him the cascade alert, the destabilized rhythm, the fact that the structural defect was progressing faster than the surgical team had anticipated, and that the on-call cardiologist was trying to determine whether Ethan was stable enough to survive an interventional procedure. She relayed it the way she processed everything accurately, sequentially, without editorializing. She had pulled the information from the attending nurse with the focused extraction of a woman who did not accept vague reassurances, and she was handing it to Marcus now with the same precision she would use to brief a crisis team at her firm. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The echo they ran last night, was it a standard apical 4-chamber view?" Victoria looked at him. "I don't know what that means." "It means the technician would have had Ethan-positioned flat probe angled up from the lower chest," Marcus said. "It's the standard approach. It gives you a good general picture. But there's a modified view, subcostal oblique patient tilted probe repositioned, that gives you a different angle on the atrioventricular junction. Last night I thought the standard echo was enough to work with. But if his condition is deteriorating the way you're describing, there may be a secondary occlusion point that the first imaging didn't reach. On the battlefield, when we didn't have full equipment, that modified view was sometimes the only way to find what we were missing." Victoria watched his face as he said it. She had spent 20 years reading people across conference tables, and she understood the difference between a man constructing a story in real time and a man reporting a fact he had known for a while and was only now choosing to say out loud. This was the second kind. "Why didn't you push for this last night?" she asked. "Because I wasn't certain it was necessary until now." He held her gaze. "And because saying it means explaining how I know it, and that's a conversation I wasn't ready to have." Victoria crossed her arms. "Have it now." He told her in the hallway outside the cardiac unit, standing under fluorescent lights at 12:47 in the morning, with the muffled sounds of the team working on her son audible through the closed doors behind her. He told her about Dana, about the months of misdiagnosis, the symptoms that accumulated in a pattern Marcus had recognized but couldn't name with the authority the doctors required. About the evening he had sat across a desk from a physician and said carefully that he thought they were missing something, and the way the physician had listened politely and then explained also carefully that Marcus's military medical training was not equivalent to a clinical differential diagnosis. About going home that night and telling himself the doctor was right, that he was overreaching, that the guilt of thinking he knew better than the people whose job it was to know better was just his ego dressed up as instinct. Dana had died 7 days later of a cardiac complication that a different imaging angle might have found in time. The internal review that followed had cleared him of wrongdoing because there was no wrongdoing to find. He hadn't been her physician, hadn't made a clinical error, hadn't done anything except fail to push hard enough when pushing hard felt like arrogance. The review board had been thorough and fair and completely beside the point. The question Marcus had lived with for 3 years was not whether he was culpable in any legal sense. It was simpler and heavier than that he had known something and he had stayed quiet and she had died. Victoria listened to all of it without speaking. When he finished, the hallway was very quiet. A nurse passed at the far end without looking toward them. The alert light above the cardiac unit door was still orange. "You're telling me this," Victoria said finally, "so that I understand why you're certain." "I'm telling you this," Marcus said, "so that you understand what it cost me the last time I wasn't." She looked at him for a long moment, the full, unguarded look of a person setting aside the architecture of judgment they'd spent years constructing. Then she turned and pushed through the doors. Victoria walked directly to the attending cardiologist, a focused woman named Dr. Sandra Okafor, who was coordinating the team's response at the central monitor station. Victoria did not ask permission, and she did not explain herself. She said, "There's a man outside this unit who served 2 tours as a combat paramedic and believes there is a secondary occlusion point in my son's defect that your current imaging hasn't identified. He knows a modified echo view that may show it. I need you to hear him out." Dr. Okafor looked up from the monitor with the expression of someone who had already been running on diminished patience for several hours. "Ms. Sterling." "My son is dying in that room," Victoria said, not loudly, not as a threat, simply as a fact that she was asking the other woman to weigh against whatever objection was forming. If he's wrong, you've lost 4 minutes. If he's right, you've found what you're missing. I am asking you to make that calculation." "Dr. Okafor made it." She gestured toward the door. Marcus came in and described the modified subcostal oblique approach to the echo technician in precise, unambiguous terms. The technician, a young woman named Claire, who had 7 years of experience and the professional self-possession not to let the strangeness of the situation slow, her hands repositioned her equipment and adjusted the probe angle, while Marcus guided her with the kind of directional instruction that comes from physical memory rather than theoretical knowledge. He had done this in conditions that made a hospital room look like a controlled environment, and his hands were steady. The image resolved on the screen at 1:23 in the morning. There it was, a secondary narrowing at the oblique margin of the defect invisible from the standard imaging angle, sitting in the precise location that was generating the occlusion driving Ethan's deteriorating rhythm. Not large, not dramatic. Exactly the kind of thing that could kill a child quietly while a team of skilled physicians looked in the right place with the wrong perspective. Dr. Okafor looked at it for 3 seconds and then turned to the surgical resident. "Get Dr. Walsh on the phone. Tell him we have a target." The interventional procedure was catheter-based, less invasive than open surgery, appropriate for a defect of this size and location carrying its own risks, but far fewer than the alternative of doing nothing, while Ethan's heart continued to fight against its own architecture. Dr. Walsh, the attending cardiac surgeon, arrived from his home in 40 minutes and reviewed the imaging without sitting down. He asked 3 questions, received 3 answers, and said they were going in. Marcus was not in the room for any of what followed. He was back in the hallway on a chair against the wall in the particular stillness of a person who has done the one thing they came to do and now has nothing left to manage. Victoria sat down beside him at 2:15 after the surgical team had taken Ethan, and the waiting became the only available action. Neither of them spoke for a while. The hallway was empty in both directions. The fluorescent light above them buzzed faintly at a frequency just below the threshold of annoyance. "The review," Victoria said eventually. "After your wife. You were cleared." "Yes," Marcus said, "but you left medicine anyway." "I left because being cleared isn't the same as being okay," he said. "Those are 2 different things, and I spent a long time mixing them up." Victoria absorbed this. Outside a window at the end of the hall, the city was dark and still. "I had someone pull your background yesterday," she said. She said it without apology because she was not a person who apologized for due diligence, but her voice carried an acknowledgement that it was something he deserved to know. "After last night, I wanted to understand who you were." "I figured," Marcus said. "The gap in your record after the contracting work started." She didn't frame it as a question exactly. "That's Lily," he said. "That's just being her dad." Victoria looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about Ethan tugging at his collar at the gala, the small automatic irritation of redirecting him the 1,000 unremarkable moments that constituted the texture of having him in her life. She thought about how easily that texture could have ended, not dramatically, not with warning, just a boy falling sideways in a crowded room, and a team of excellent physicians treating the wrong thing while the right answer stood outside a glass panel in a worn jacket. "I owe you something I don't know how to quantify," she said. Marcus shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." "I'm going to disagree with you on that." "That's your right," he said. "But I didn't come back tonight because of what you owe me. I came back because he's 8 years old." Ethan came through the procedure at 4:12 in the morning. Dr. Walsh emerged from the surgical suite and told Victoria that the occlusion had been successfully addressed, that the structural defect had been repaired with a small catheter-deployed closure device, and that, barring complications which he considered unlikely, given the precision of the repair, her son would recover fully. He would need monitoring and follow-up imaging at regular intervals for the next several years and some restrictions on contact sports in the immediate term. Otherwise, he was expected to live a completely normal life. Victoria thanked him. She shook his hand. She walked back to the hallway and sat down next to Marcus and said nothing for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "Thank you." 2 words. Not decorated, not cushioned inside a longer sentence. Just the words themselves from a woman who had spent most of her adult life keeping gratitude at a professional distance and who was no longer doing that. Marcus nodded once. He looked tired in the way people look when something they've been carrying for a long time has finally been set down, not lighter yet exactly, but different. Like the body is still adjusting to the changed weight. In the weeks that followed, Victoria did not offer Marcus money. She had understood from the way he operated that it wasn't what he needed. What she did instead was use the full weight of Sterling Capital's influence to push St. Matthew's Hospital and 2 affiliated institutions to adopt a mandatory cardiac screening protocol for pediatric patients, specifically targeting the class of congenital defects that had gone undetected in Ethan. She worked with Dr. Calloway and Dr. Okafor to formalize the modified imaging technique Marcus had described into the hospital's standard diagnostic training. She did it without press releases or public announcements. She just made it happen, the way she made most things happen quietly, completely, and without asking for credit. Marcus was informed of this through a brief letter from the hospital's chief medical officer acknowledging his contribution and confirming that no further action would be taken by the inquiry board. Dr. Calloway had submitted a final statement that left no ambiguity about the sequence of events or the role Marcus had played. The 2 physicians who had given contradicting accounts declined to comment further. When Ethan was well enough to have visitors, he asked his mother to arrange for him to meet the man who helped. Victoria brought Marcus to the hospital on a Saturday morning, Lily in tow, carrying a drawing she had made of the hospital, because Ethan had mentioned he liked art. Ethan had made something too. It was a drawing of 2 figures, one in a white coat, one in regular clothes. He had colored the figure in regular clothes slightly larger. He handed it to Marcus without explanation, with the matter-of-fact generosity of a child who considers the meaning self-evident. Marcus took it home and put it on the refrigerator. That evening, after Lily was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the apartment and thought about Dana. Not with the old weight, the particular gravity of a guilt that has been carried so long it starts to feel like part of the body. He thought about her the way you think about someone you loved imperfectly, with tenderness, with the ordinary ache of absence, rather than the sharp edge of a wound. He thought about the night she died, and the night Ethan almost did, and the difference between them not in the outcome, but in the choice he had made, the second time he had spoken. That was all. He had walked through a door and said what he knew to be true and refused to be quiet about it regardless of what it cost him. It hadn't required a credential or a title or anyone's permission. It had only required him to stop treating his own silence as a form of humility when what it actually had always been, was fear. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. Outside, the city was doing what cities do, indifferent, continuous, full of people moving through their own invisible emergencies. And somewhere across town, an 8-year-old boy with a repaired heart was asleep in his own bed for the first time in 2 weeks, dreaming whatever it is children dream when the adults in their lives have against considerable odds managed to get things right. The worth of a person has never lived in their credentials. It lives in what they do when staying quiet would be easier and when the cost of speaking is something only they will have to pay. If this story moved, you subscribe and stick around. There are more stories worth telling, and we're just getting started.